is I'm just going to introduce a little bit about the thematics of the panel and let you know the format in which we run it. So the panel's titled Exploring Social Identity and Culture, Perspectives from Delhi and Kolkata. We have 3 papers, all 3 very diverse, but all pick up the questions of what it means to be and belong to cities, and ask both the questions of what cities do and make of us, and how that process of making in turn shapes cities themselves. And I think it will be very good for us as audiences to listen to both the directions of argument that are being made across these 3 papers, both in terms of a direction of shape and being shaped at the same time. And I think the other thing that's really great about these 3 papers is that they draw on very different forms of archives. And I think that it's very good to juxtapose quite deliberately. The Brazilian anthropologist Teresa Caldeira often talks about the juxtaposition of dissimilar things as ways to open up new ways of inquiry. And I think what's really nice about this panel is that it is both a very familiar juxtaposition. We've all been branded culture and identity, as we often are on this end of the social sciences. But it's, when you look into it, a juxtaposition of deeply dissimilar things at the same time. And I think it'll be great if we pull out those threads. Each of our speakers will take between 15 and 20 minutes, which means we'll all try to take 15 and end up taking 20. Okay? But I am, as I have warned the panel, a slightly orthodox, disciplinarian, quite strict of a chair. So we will actually stick to that time, because I think that the richness of the conversation that will follow with an audience like this shouldn't be sacrificed. And at the end of your presentations, I'll leave one question from me to each of the speakers, which they'll answer alongside your questions at the end. Okay, fair game? So we take the order of the program, and I'm very happy to introduce Runa Choudhury from the University of Calcutta. And her talk is called Menus Matter, Examining Class and Bengali Cuisine Culture Through Restaurant Menus in Kolkata.
Is it all right? Okay, thanks Gautam, and a very good afternoon to all of you. I'd move straight to the paper, which is Menus Matter. Hello, is this okay? Okay, right. So, I begin. So, in a recent Bengali film, Machir Jhol, Fish Curry, 2017, directed by Protim Gupta, the protagonist, Debdatta Sen, returns to Kolkata after 13 years to visit his critically ill mother. She asks his son to prepare a particular fish curry he had cooked when he used to stay in Kolkata. Instantly, Debdatta has all the traits of a global Bengali. He is now Dev D, an internationally renowned chef and restaurateur who owns several Michelin-starred restaurants in France and USA, and lives in Paris with his French girlfriend. The fish curry project makes Debdatta fight bitter ghosts of the past as he churns up fish recipes one after the other, none of which appeases his mother. After many a curry, he hits on a fresh recipe, Komula Katla, which is freshwater fish in orange gravy. Chef, his much yearned nod. As his mother relishes the new dish, she confides that he had succeeded in cooking her wished-for recipe in his very first attempt, but she had knowingly dismissed it since she wanted him to create his own new recipe. The fish curry in this film becomes a metaphor for reliving old memories, for revisiting long-lost relations, but above all, to reconcile the past with an evolving new. Debdatta represents the new upwardly mobile Bengali who belongs to the space of a trans nation and embraces all which equips him to claim eligibility for staking a global citizenship. In the making of this new Bengali identity in its cosmopolitan oeuvre, food plays an important role. This paper predominantly analyzes perceptions of affluent upper-middle-class Bengalis and a few non-Bengali interlocutors in Kolkata concerning entries of various Bengali restaurants' menu cards. It seeks to examine how these evaluations are often influenced by a narrative of a reclamation of heritage in a cosmopolitan mode. In this context, restaurant menu cards, I argue, are emblematic of articulating differences and distinctions in matters of class and taste, which socially mark the choice of a distinctive food moment. Here, neo-ethnicity is to be understood as the stylized presentation of traditional cultures of food, which are pitched at a level such that they may participate in a global order. It is a value nurtured in the Bengali transnational imaginary to strive to claim for its own ethnic identity the label of world-class cosmopolitanism. So this paper has 4 sections. The first examines the need of the study. The second outlines the method. In the third, I trace the relationship between restaurant food and specializing in a regional cuisine and class. And finally, in the final section, I'll try to analyze the making of food connoisseurship and the celebration of neo-ethnicity through restaurant menu entries of Bengali restaurants. So the first is, moving on to the need of the study. While concerns on taste, consumption, and class identifications have been raised in scholarship on Bengali food culture, these have accepting studies on street food, mostly addressed home cooking in the domestic context. This can partially be explained by the fact that the consumption of Bengali food is usually restricted to the realm of home-cooked food. This paper attempts to address the gap of relative scarcity of studies on cultures of public dining practices, particularly in Bengali restaurants. It does so by exploring how a burgeoning ethnic restaurant industry serving Bengali food in Kolkata conditions class-inherent food practices. It is true that the propitious public setting of a Bengali restaurant for observing ethnicity is a relatively recent phenomenon. A fresh crop of restaurants serving Bengali food in Kolkata have spawned post-2000s, O Calcutta, QP's, Bohemian, 6 Baliganj Place, Shoptapudi, and there are many others, pushing the envelope when it comes to the way the urban folk are eating, what they're eating, and how they're eating. In fact, Bengali restaurants are emerging as public gastro destinations, dynamic sites of consumption, unfolding intense mediations on structures of class and choice for a growing clientele. I move on to the second section of the paper, which is the study, which outlines the methodology. 46 in-depth interviews, including those of 28 men and 18 women between 35 to 69 years of age, were conducted in 2 phases, stretching over 16 months in 2017-18. I started with my own acquaintances and eventually, following a snowballing method, drew upon respondents belonging to affluent upper middle class Bengali families. Many of these families had at least one member residing outside the city, and some non-Bengali families, and by some I mean that 19 of the 46 respondents were non-Bengalis, including 8 Punjabis, 5 Biharis, 4 Assamese, and 2 Bangaloreans. The interviews conducted stretched between 70 to 90 minutes, with a few extending over 2 hours. An identical packet of 10 anonymized and numbered restaurant menu cards and 2 charts of price hotels representing a cross-sampling of restaurants by class were given to each interview respondent. A coding worksheet was also provided to each to facilitate the analysis of menus and dimensions, including recipes, prices, vocabulary, and style of presentation. All interview respondents also produced a restaurant key, a record of all restaurants which they could recapitulate to have visited in the previous couple of years preceding the present study. The restaurant keys yielded information concerning the context of the restaurant visits, with whom they had dined, the kinds of dining arrangements they had chosen, signature dishes they had tried, if any, and a general overview of their favorite eating out destination. So I move on to the third section, which I have titled What's the Menu, which is discourses on food and tasting class. In this section, I'll try to outline 3 major points. The first is that in the present study, interview respondents identified higher than average prices, the presence of bar menus, fusion cuisine, or specialized gourmet of yesteryears in high-end restaurants. Describing the presentation of Bengali restaurant menu charts of upmarket restaurants like Ahili, O Calcutta, 6 Baliganj Place as stylish, classy, and posh, respondents quoted these as catering to the Obhijato, that is the aristocrat, and Dhoni, that is the moneyed people. Low prices and simplicity of presentation of menu entries, especially those which appeared unpretentious, at your face, basic, non-descriptive, easily identifiable by their names, led respondents to identify them as Shadharon or ordinary. So this led me to conclude that steep prices elevated restaurant menus to an upper echelon. The second is that while a Bengali Hindu past or an Anglo-Indian tradition is interpolated in the many dishes which crowd the menu cards of Bengali restaurants, there is a marked absence of food items which tells of a Muslim past. This is significant given that the Mughlai cuisine, mostly associated with a formal meal and dining out, has always had a distinct position in the strategy of cuisines in Calcutta. On their part, Bengalis admire Mughlai food as an ethnic cuisine of a significant other, and examples of Bengalijized Mughlai food, though relatively scarce, do exist. For instance, every Bengali loves a bite of his own Mughlai paratha, with eateries having adapted the recipe in a manner to suit local tastes. Yet, Bengali restaurant menu cards have proved miserly in not including food with a Muslim Nawabi tag, given that a distinctive Awadhi cuisine effect, hailed as Nawab Wajid Ali Shah's gift of gourmet food, had once had its heyday in the city. A first logistic reason which has plausibly deterred Bengali restaurants to do so might lay in the fact that Mughlai cuisine, having long enjoyed the status of restaurant food in Kolkata, claims for itself a clearly segmented market with a competitive edge. Second, even when the period dining experience of Nawabi cuisine does get acclaimed in a fine dining restaurant like Out 1590, it is more about fetting a pan-Indian trend than a Bengali one. This is well demonstrated when 6 Baliganj plates in its customized catering menus place mutton dak banglo, which is a recipe with a colonial heritage, under the Bengali category, but that of a Muslim recent like mutton rogan josh under Indian recipes on mutton. Of course, Wajid Ali's patronizing of Awadhi delicacies while in exile in Kolkata occasioned Mughlai cuisine to flourish in Media Burus, and Out 1590 launched its third flagship outlet in 2015 to mark the 195th birthday of the Nawab. For that matter, in September 2018, Bengal Lounge, a unit of 6 Baliganj plates, did celebrate Kebab-e-Ishq, a royal kebab festival exoticizing Mughlai cuisine at its hilt. Despite such novel occasions being celebrated, and here's where I make the point, the local history of Nawabi food in Bengal has mostly remained in oblivion for Bengalis, and accordingly, the mainstreaming of Mughlai cuisine in the Bengali restaurant food map is found lacking. So Bengali restaurants often, so I move to the third point, Bengali restaurants often does reproduce the authentic by turning inwards, in which case the other Indian is reinvented as some kind of a lost tradition. A recipe like Goalandar Murgi, famed to be a stew cooked in the steamer in Goalando in erstwhile pre-partition East Bengal, now Bangladesh, today finds a place in the menu card of QPs. In this way, local histories, when they survive through cultural artifacts like menu cards in a global world, become in an important sense globalized. However, if restaurant food claims for itself a strong ethnic essentialism and a specific identity, it would have little room to maneuver in the business. So hybridization of Bengali cuisine has been an unavoidable social process, and chefs with a flair for innovation have been instrumental in adding new items to enhance what is understood as fine dining experience. It has been argued that the Bengali middle class in the post-independent era cultivated their cuisine as a liberal and cosmopolitan one, in which which entailed the incorporation of other flavors and their subsequent indigenization. It was a kind of cosmopolitanism which involved an appreciation of the other and of constructing a common space between separate spheres within which one moves. In the global latitude, however, when cosmopolitanisms require us to ground our sense of mutuality and to learn to live in conditions of mutability, it is no longer a question of appreciation or, for that matter, accommodation of different cultures. Rather, cosmopolitanisms create a condition of creative bricolage, in this case of taste, producing what is to be understood, and this is what I call gastro-cosmopolitanism. The latter is an attitude practiced by the contemporary cosmopolitan diners who live or perceive to live their lives within the scope of a transnation. It breeds an elite sensitivity, identifiably urban, amongst consumers whose shared experience is based on a certain loss of rootedness and who wish to reclaim their roots in ways which are stylishly traditional and yet not garishly ethnic. Now, the last point that I would try to make in this section is that 70% of the interview respondents rated Bengali restaurants which offered fusion cuisines as Uccho Muddhabitto, that is upper middle class. So Mahashweta, and I quote a 34-year-old Kolkata-bred call center professional residing in Gurgaon, who spoke in a highly accented Bengali, and this is what she said: I caught up with a jamming session of my favorite brand Chandra Bindu with Pooja, my roommate from Gurgaon. She was visiting Kolkata for the first time during Navratri halls. Then we had headed to Bohemian for dinner. I wanted to give her an insight into Bong culture, not the Chapusha type. You know what I mean. Bohemian Pooja was delighted with the menu spread and found it quite uppity. And we had a great time gossiping over food that evening. Bohemian is instantly one of the most talked about fusion restaurants in town, which makes makeover dishes infused with Bengali spices. So Mahashweta identifies herself as Bong, the hybrid, educated middle class, and one who represents all that is Bengali outside the city. Sorry, I just moved to the second slide. Yes, so, and she has the onus to represent her culture beyond the chaposha, which is the familiarly plebeian. Showcasing art culinary artistry, many of Bohemian's menu items have an international approach, designed as these are, as I was saying, with makeover spices, ingredients, and supplements. It is amply clear from her comment that Mohashita had consciously chosen Bohemian to flaunt her Bengaliness and sport her opulently cultured taste for food with an exotic appeal. So she wanted to enjoy her own food, but in ways which scrupulously associates her dispositions with the habitus of a global ethnic Bengali. But on the other hand, we have Shima Mitro, who is a 59-year-old housewife who grudgingly confided that she saw no meaning in pabda, which is Indian butterfish, being stewed in cherry tomato and spinach broth or prawns with grapes. And she said, and this is what she said, I would like my dal bhat, which is staple light rice lentils, over such food items any day. End quote. So if she had stopped at this, it could plausibly be argued that this is a middle class reaction in the form of puritanism. Or reverse snobism, that is what I call, that dull food is idealized as simple and plain, while the luxuries of the fortunate are viewed as alien. Shima is saying that food in Bohemian was high-class Bengali food. A lot of culinary experiments is involved. This is what she said, that there is a lot of culinary experiments which are involved. This implies that innovative food designing is being treated as an invention associated with distinctive class associations. Shima may not qualify as a cosmopolitan, but her awareness of trending classy hybrid tastes of new age Bengali food reveals her understanding that these distinctly function as markers of class. So I move to the final section, which I have titled, Who Tastes? Practicing Food Connoisseurship. So the present study revealed that the attitude of diners towards styled ethnic food and cocktails are also classified. Restaurant menus seeking to impress their intended clients or guests often style up ethnic cuisine and drinks in a way which make local food look foreign. Speaking of a captivating concoction, Madhavan Pillai, Bangalorean banker in his late 40s, who was all praised for an unforgettable Bengali-style cocktail, Kalbuishaki, which is the magical alliance of vodka and Ampura Sharbat. Ampura Sharbat is a traditional Bengali welcome drink, which was offered in the beverage menu of O Calcutta. Thanking his Bengali colleague who had introduced him to this delightful concoction, Madhavan spoke of how he had made sure to invite potential guests over a drink if he was in Kolkata, if he had a meeting in Kolkata. While the instrumentality of winning over clients is apparent, this also signals towards nurturing a distinctive sociability that cocktails, what I say, class with styled ethnicity. Here, the unfamiliarity of the beverage, which blends ingredients from different cultures, enhances its exotic quotient. Stylized food entries often elicited qualified reviews from guests in non-resident Bengalis, and this is very important. I had Horunendu Chatterjee, who spoke on this classical French preparation infused, this is called prawn thermido, and he commented on a recipe called Moripata flavored prawn thermido, that is prawn thermido infused with fennel seeds, basically, okay? So he said, and he's an engineer who's residing in Frankfurt for the last 28 years, and he did not appear dismissive. And he said, I quote him, tastes have changed. Displaying the character of a connoisseur, Orunendu seems well informed that the contemporary Bengali kitchen is innovating new dishes in a restorative drive to preserve ethnicity in a global world. But he turned nostalgic while speaking about traditional dishes like shukto and muchar ghonto, and these are very traditional food items in Bengal. And he said, which he had savored at QPs, all of which he said reminded him of good old home cooking. So for Bengalis grazing as global citizens, the imagined pleasures of savoring home-like food in restaurants signifies that the kitchen is not dead, rather it is only undergoing cultural and nostalgic renovation. More important than nostalgia, however, is the role of the taster in appraising food items. And we had Chirag Paul, who is the proprietor of Kosher Kosher, who gloated on the fact, when I interviewed him, he said that people from all over the world come to my restaurant in Ripon Street and they ask for black mutton. They can't pronounce half of the things in my restaurant menu cards. They're all foreign guests, but they want the black mutton. Black mutton is kosher mangsho, which is very traditional Bengali food, mutton recipe. So what is noteworthy is that the merit of the dish increases when appreciated and by default authenticated, by people with cosmopolitan taste. So so I move to the conclusion basically that in a multicultural city like Kolkata, the invention of fusion food seem to have created their niche in the foodscape of the land. It appears as if authenticity is no longer questioned. As long as the recipes that appear authentic are provided, as symbolic anchors on which identification can unfold. This displaces the often made distinction between traditional and new fusion dishes offered in in different kinds of Bengali restaurants. The distinction is the outcome only if we are frozen in time, thinking of authenticity as some kind of a naturally occurring category. This is an ingenuous proposition because authenticity in a fast globalizing world, it gets maneuvered by people who are running the restaurant. So what is authenticity? So there is actually, therefore, no really real food. Once, you ask questions about what are the kinds of authenticities which have to cope with diversities in a global world. And to ask deeper questions about what kinds of authenticity, and this is what I have quoted from Srinivas, what kinds of authenticity will find a place in a market in this brave new global era. So in analyzing diversities in the food template in Bengali restaurant menu cards, one fails to conclusively arrive at an ideal notion of gastro-cosmopolitanism, because such an attempt is a fool's errand. First, this is because the making of a new ethnic global identity is not only influenced by people on the move, but it's also equally affected by Shima, who is a non-mover, but who reorganize their new experiences on food through the prism of class. For both movers and non-movers, the profiling of food is never rooted only through class or only through food. So it is rather the intersectionality of food vis-a-vis class where authenticity and questions of what is authentic get shaped. And again, these are scalar and classified for differentially placed Bengalis in the real or imagined transnational horizon. Secondly, the evaluation of Bengali food is not only made by cultural aficionados and non-residents, but most notably by cultural visitors and non-Bengalis eating out in Bengali restaurants. The latter are a people, that is these non-Bengalis are a people whose omnivory appreciates the pleasures of variety and who are not plagued by any Venetian view of food, like the division between good authentic food and the bad counterfeit. So when a fusion Bengali food platter is appreciated by non-Bengalis, it certainly augments the stature of food as upmarket, trendy and are fashionably authentic. Since authenticity mingles with the forces of the market, extolling fusion food as good legitimates it as authentic and by reflection adds status and legitimacy to the authenticator as well. Okay, so while authenticity can be the search for something lost for Odunendu, it is also paradoxically the legitimation of something existing for Madhavan. So the return of the native to his own land, real or imagined, and to his own food transforms its quotidian character. The food once familiar undergoes a refamiliarization as home-like food becomes available in the public realm of restaurants. In this encounter, the homeliness of food has to be convincingly persuasive to cater to tastes of nostalgia, memory, and authenticity. Yet the menu items of Bengali restaurant menu cards is what I say as conveys more than these. Food entries, both traditional and fusion, are presented in manners enticingly classes such that home food turns avant-garde and fusion food wears an exotic appeal. Often sprinkled with a spice of world-class cosmopolitanism, restaurant menu cards, therefore, I argue, represent ideal sites for, classing their honorary Bengali guests. Thank you.
Much, Runu. So Mike, a quick question that I leave for you as we move on to the next paper. So food in one way, in my reading of it in many ways, has actually been one of the most powerful languages of cosmopolitanism, precisely for the non-elite. So I just want you to speak a little bit about thinking about what it means to study gastro-cosmopolitanism through the practices of elite food culture. It's not to say that studying elite food culture is illegitimate, but how does one then read a claim to cosmopolitanism and not a study of the cosmopolitanism of the elite? Because there is a gap between those two claims. And I'm struck, for example, if one would think about putting your work in conversation with the work, say, of Aiwa Ong and Ananya Roy, who would speak against the idea of the global or the cosmopolitan and speak instead in the favor of worlding practices, right? Located ways of belonging to something bigger than yourself, which don't make you global. And it's not like Michelin star or not, Kolkata restaurants are never going to make that global, right? But it is about an act of worlding while remaining in place. So what do we think about this archive of elite practices of food culture? And that leads me to the second part of the question I want to leave with you. I'm a little struck by the absence of caste in your analysis of food. And I think that in many ways, categories around traditional cuisine, authentic cuisine, Bengali cuisine, cosmopolitanism, and class, to me, especially in food practice and Indian sociology, cannot be read outside caste. So how does caste traverse your argument? And when we open it up, it'll be great for you to respond. Thank you very much. All right, our second speaker is Rajarshee Choudhury from Jawaharlal Nehru University, whose paper is entitled Fear, Activism and the Formation of Counter-Urban Consciousness, Experiencing Delhi from the Margins, a Case of Katputli Colony.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhan. I am this is a part of my doctoral dissertation which I'm writing, and I must confess this is an idea that I'm throwing out here, just to open it up for discussion mostly. So I'd be very glad for your comments.
Hold it a bit closer. No, that's fine. Hold it a bit closer to you. No, it's on. Hold it a bit.
Okay, yeah, right. So I'm going to be reading out certain sections from the paper, and then would be very glad if you could come back to me with comments and suggestions. So as we are all aware, a renewed interest in urban scholarship now seeks to provincialize the urban. Now, to borrow liberally from Dipesh Chakravarti's assertions as a discipline, to merely go beyond seeking to extend practices borrowed uncritically from the West, as the work of Ananya Roy, Jennifer Robinson, Nizar Al-Sayed, and the others have amply demonstrated. So in this paper, armed with this understanding, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to propose the following things. 1. The relationship between the state and the various populations in the city is unequal to begin with. This only gets magnified in case of cities that claim global status. Second, the population residing in the margins of the city are fearful of dispossession, day in and day out, as they must contend with the disciplining state, seek to reappropriate the city spaces for agents of capital. Thirdly, the fear of dispossession does not translate into inaction, however, and this is where I seek to contribute. I argue that it is this fear of dispossession which motivates them to organize into collective action and use both formal and informal means to negotiate with the state, or the agents of capital, as it were. And this is the resistance which I argue leads to the formation of a counter-urban consciousness. This, where I say, is an argument which sees being in the city not conditional on your capacity to consume, but rather produce the everyday spaces of resistance. And finally, I argue the production of everyday spaces of resistance has the potential to stall the smooth intrusion of capital into the city, and so doing reverse the revanchism that has come to characterize most of the global cities. Now quickly, I'll just give you a snippet of the Katputli colony. This colony, this slum, this neighborhood has been people coming in from Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, and other various parts of the country. And as the name suggests, it's a colony of puppeteers. There are also magicians, street performers, snake charmers who reside here. Over time, however, this colony is also deeply heterogeneous in the sense that there are not just artists residing, but there are non-artists residing who started to come here post the 1970s. Articulate. So this became the first bone of contention when Rajiv said, this was interesting and the first of its kind in India because this sought to collapse living spaces, working spaces, and community into one. Moving on. Now, what are the fears then, in everyday Katputli colony? The Raheja developers and the DDA as part of the in-situ rehabilitation process, under which Raheja developers had to undertake not only rehabilitating the place, but also resettling the people exactly as they were. However, the presidents did not take to it very kindly. They protested, and there were various hurdles, obviously. Within those hurdles, the first argument that they made was that they staked claim to space vis-a-vis their difference. They said that we are not like any other slum or any other colony which you seek to rehabilitate. We are a special case, if you argue, and one that preserves, and this they used, the ancient cultures of India. So it was a case for them to make spaces. Now, essentially speaking, what were the fears? If I were to interrogate the fears of the population, the first thing had to do with the violence that was meted out by the state. A while back, I spoke of the disciplining state vis-a-vis the caring state. Now, the caring state was absent. For the past 40 years, the caring state has been absent for these people. What has been present and recurring feature of their daily lives has been the disciplining state. For instance, when in 2017, the first round of demolitions began, that was the first time they saw the might of the state. The state came. There was no guarantee where they were going to be rehabilitated or how they were going to be rehabilitated. The only thing that they knew was that they had to pack up their belongings in a matter of hours, if not days, and just leave. Two places were selected, Anand Parbat and Narela, as the transit camps. Now, this is important, and the existing literature, obviously, there's still an ongoing process, which means that I had to refer to mostly newspaper reports or blogs or articles for that matter. But this was important because this was when a sense of belonging started to develop, which did not merely limit itself to artists or non-artists. This was a new phase wherein you had artists and non-artists coming in together and articulating a case wherein they said that this space is ours, irrespective of us being artists or non-artists. That did not necessarily matter to them. So this section I'm going to be reading out, it's called Living in 21st Century Delhi, Everyday Struggle for the Marginalized. Now, aspiring to be a global city, the 21st century has especially been harsh for those without an exclusive ability to partake in the culture of consumption. Being able to consume is not only seen as a marker of progress, but more importantly, almost as a precondition of belonging to the city. Now, this has what it's done is has offered space for proliferation of a new set of ideals that criminalizes poverty and which, unlike the previous century, conceives of poverty not as failures of the state, but as owing to inherent faults in the people themselves. It essentializes traits within the population. The gentleman to my right, I refer to extensively for this. What stands out most in this phase has been the accelerated demolitions of slums and squatter settlements, accompanied by evictions. Evictions and demolitions are but an extension of the idea. Now, how is it naturalized in everyday discourse? One, these places are hubs of antisocial activities, and thus by getting rid of the physical structure, it's believed that order could once again be imposed. Secondly, the presence of slums and squatters as virtually privileging the freeloaders. This was the argument made that at the expense of the honest and tax-paying citizen. This was a view echoed in the judgment of Almitra Patel versus the Union of India, when the court compared the slum dwellers as akin to pickpockets, which the court said that if you were to rehabilitate them, you would essentially be rewarding a pickpocket. And finally, it is necessary to bring dilapidated areas into the ambit of capital. Now, this is the idea, distinction between dead and live capital made by the Chilean economist Fernando. They all over the world own large property, but then there's nothing happening to the property. In a sense, it means that there's no redevelopment happening. So in order to bring them into the ambit of production and capital, the state needs to forcibly step in. Now, as if the economic and social arguments behind evictions weren't enough, there are other two scholars that I'm referring to here, Amitabh Avishkar and Asher Gertner here, where Gertner calls a practice of governing without numbers, when he says the state has moved beyond practice of merely calculating how many slums are there and how many need to be demolished, instead going to an aesthetic logic, wherein the mere presence of a slum is discomforting enough for the state to step in and clean it up. Amitabh Avishkar also contributes here, saying that the concern in Delhi especially for the environment is nothing but an extension of bourgeois practices. She calls it bourgeois environmentalism. Now, if you're focusing on these, it is this specifically which will reveal a sense of belonging in the city. What does it do for the poor then? The poor then start to believe that the city is not theirs and they need to do something actively to take back that space. And this is what I've been referring to as counter-urban consciousness throughout my paper. And the next section I will try and elaborate on this. Now, how do I define counter-urban consciousness? A sensitivity, order, and from Neil Smith. Even in the 1970s, the DDA had this drive of trying to redevelop the Katputli colony, wherein they engaged with discussions with the residents there. Now, that bore little fruit. However, this process got accelerated with a public-private partnership, and that logic since 2009. The DDA the state and the capital, they are on one side of the argument, and the people residing, I find, are on the other side. The uses of land envisaged by the former are motivated by a developmental paradigm. Now it's at odds with the residents of the Katputli colony, who believe that for them, it cannot be a development-oriented argument that feeds an everyday. As I've already mentioned, it is the case of living, residing, and also working. The space is the same. So while the DDA argues that you will give you better flats, will give you better amenities, they say it's pointless. We're going to lose where are we going to practice our craft? And even if we are able to practice our craft, what is the assurance that our neighbors, who then are going to be the upward mobile population, are going to accept us here in the first place? So the argument of in situ rehabilitation, which the DDA has, sort of, as far as these populations are concerned, falls flat on its face. Now, moving on, this section is called Past Papers and Resistance Belonging in the Global City. What has been seen in most of them, not just Delhi, but also Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Chennai, is a constant filing of public interest litigations which articulate in the name of greater good. The middle class here sort of argues that the existence of a slum or an informal market violates aesthetics, and because by merely violating aesthetics, they will stop the intrusion of capital, which then stops development, which is antithetical to the good of all. A very interesting distinction I found was that how the people of Delhi chose to identify themselves. The middle class propertied, for instance, would speak of being citizens of a city. So their conception of space is increasingly being dominated by belonging to a city which ascribes to be global, a global power center, not just a national power center. Whereas the poor, when they are articulating their claims, they are doing so on the basis of belonging to India, a country. They argue to the rights that are guaranteed to them by the constitution. So what I can argue here is that both parties are using legal mechanisms to make their case, whereas the former choose legal mechanisms to show that they are entitled to certain specific rights by virtue of their social, economic, and cultural privilege. It is also the second group who argue that because they're citizens of this state, a state guarantees them that rights. So they are directly appealing to the state by similar mechanisms, by petitions, by demonstrations, or even by referring to reports. Now, this section is called Fear, Activism, and Counter-Urban Consciousness. How do they live everyday lives? The literature that is present on urban fear sort of presents a security-oriented narrative. The fact that the fear of being mugged, the fear of being robbed, the fear of not being safe, the vision, the imagination that is built centers around, again, the white-collared propertied worker. But when we look at, if I were to examine fear, what does fear mean for those people who are living at the margins of the city? Of course, physical security and safety is important, and they've said as much. But what really takes precedence is how do they go about their everyday lives, wherein the state intrudes. We find the state coming in and demolishing their properties, denying them even the basic right to work and live. So that sort of is a disjuncture which is not really present in that literature. Now, it is this fear, and I'm going to read out once again, it is this fear that acts an enabler in terms of interacting with the state. Instead of conceiving fear as conceptualized as an emotion that numbs or colonizes the disenfranchised, they're not numbed, they're not colonized, they're not short of imagination, but in fact, on the contrary, it is precisely this fear of being dispossessed and pushed further to the margins that enables them to act in imaginative ways. For instance, they will form alliances beyond their immediate community. They'll reach activists, they'll reach academics, they'll sit in, they'll demonstrate, which they weren't doing until and unless the state, the disciplining state as it were, made its presence felt. Now, what this does, I believe, is create an alternative urban subject. Now, this urban subject will not reference his position or her position via the relative capacity to partake in the city as consumers of a global culture. No, that is not their primary form of reference. One is reminded here of the idea of Henry Lefebvre and his work Right to the City, wherein he says cities are spaces that are shaped every day by people who live there, irrespective of wherein they belong on the economic ladder. But in the 21st century, this idea can be tweaked with a little, because urban centers are seen as, well, Lefebvre was writing in the 60s and 70s, wherein still this idea of blocks sort of had predominance in social science literature, and now we've moved on to networked ideas. The fact that the opportunity for expressing and asserting autonomy today in societies and cities that are largely global and are largely networked is that reality manifests when an extraordinary situation is confronted by the people in question. For them, reality, they'll face reality. The right to the city they will only assert wherein they see a tangible threat to their very existence, which is the doing of the state. And this is beyond the cultures of consumption that defines the city. Now I'm going to conclude. This article, by focusing on Kathputli colony and Delhi, has shown that benevolent practices, development practices, violate the everyday ideas of space, home, and belonging in the city. This essay has illustrated, I've attempted to illustrate, that how for the past 4 decades the neighborhood has been in the eye of a storm between firstly the state and the people, and now there's a third party that is added, that's the private interest, wherein the state and the private interest seek to align against the residents, and they are motivated purely by commercial and capital interests. This piece is argued as to how fear among the population in the margins arises out of the actions of the state and does not necessarily owe its presence to some stranger lurking in the shadows. Another argument that I've tried to make is that a counter-urban consciousness not only presents of how the city ought to be from the vantage of the periphery, but also importantly reminds us that space was and always will be fluid in urban spaces. I just like to recall an anecdote. This was a conversation. This was not an interview. This was a conversation I was having with the DUSIB official. I had walked in sometime in the afternoon in the sweltering heat of Delhi with the air conditioner not working. And I sort of expected him to be, to not be very accommodating. But instead he was very accommodating. And that was the first shock I had. And secondly, I expected him to not have anything decent to say about the people who are living in the margins or the people living in the slums. But then he said, you know, I am amazed at the resistance and tenacity that these people are showing. I sort of expected them to give up, quit, and leave. They've not done that. They're still here, and he believes they're still going to be here, wherein the plans, the programs, and the developmental ideas are reduced to no more than a footnote in some obscure register in a governmental locker.
So as the gentleman on your right, I have a couple of questions to give to you. I think there's a lot that you're pushing us to think about in this paper, right? And I think that the idea of thinking about what kind of politics emerges and roots itself in an experience of fear is a very powerful one. Right? Because you can think about a lot of the politics against dispossession, against urban development, rooted in other kinds of affects, of claims, of dignity, of rights, of anger. And I think it's important to think a little bit about fear as one of those affective locations for politics. But I want to push you a little bit on your articulation of it. And there's 2 specific things I have in mind. The first is it possible to distinguish between the caring state and the disciplining state? Because if the state could appear here, as the gentleman on your left, all right, what they would say is, I'm precisely doing the job of caring. Right? Kathputli is not an eviction, it is a redevelopment, right? As you're pointing out. People are meant to get homes in the same place, right? All the process questions aside, what the state could say to you is, you screamed at me for years that I do nothing about urban poor communities. I'm coming and rebuilding them into flats. Now you're telling me that I'm not supposed to care this way. So you can well imagine a family sibling fight where you say, first you tell me you don't love me, then when I love you, you say, don't love me like this, love me like that. Right? So how do you distinguish between this disciplining and the caring state? And how do we rescue some notion of intentional change Because the thing about, if you take a lot of urban personality scholars, the thing we all struggle with is that the state is eternally indispensable and eternally inadequate at the same time. At the same time, all our claims of rights are made to the state, who in the same thing we say, but you will never deliver this, for which we will beat you up, but you must. How do we get out of this logjam between indispensability and inadequacy? What do we do? How do we move? And the second point I want to push you a little bit to think about is, you're making an argument that the idea of a counter-urban consciousness or certain urban practices begin at a moment of violence. But at the same time, you're telling us that the everyday practices of production are 30 years old. And there's a contradiction in that. Because what it means is that these everyday practice of producing Katputli colony, right, how do they not imply a counter-urban consciousness that has always existed? Because the production of Katputli to the occupation of public land, the acquisition of services, has always been in tension with the state. That's the very definition of self-built auto-construction in southern urbanism. You build in tension with the law. You build in tension with the state. So why would we acknowledge a now it becomes more spectacular in an incident of spectacular violence. It becomes more visible or takes different forms at that temporal moment. But surely your own argument is that the everyday practices of resistance are exactly the citizenship of these residents from decades. It is the state that has now recognized that DUSIB officer in the end of your anecdote is just catching up to a set of spatial practices that have always been fighting the state in a different way. Right? So what do we do with the everyday practices of resistance and the spectacular moment of organized resistance against a specific act of violence? How do we connect those two conceptually? And I think if you're going to invoke Lefebvre's whole idea of the right to the city was precisely not about resistance, but about everyday making. It was about the city as oeuvre, as a work of art. It was about walking as a way of making the city, belonging, right? So the idea there was that production was resistance. So could you think about pushing against the idea that everyday practices of production are distinct from everyday practice of resistance? Because maybe perhaps they're actually precisely the same thing. Okay? Thank you very much for your paper. Asaf, our last presenter of this session is Asaf Ali Lone, who works at the Center for Public Interest Law at Jindal Global Law School, and his paper is called Exploring Identity in Space to the Study of Housing Rental Markets in Delhi.
Thank you, Gautam. So, I will start with a very small experience on my field. So, it was a field visit in Batla House. Famous for Batla House encounter and infamous for its biryani and all. And so one of the respondents was doing her PhD in psychology, asked a very poignant question. So she asked, why is this area, Batla House, called backward? While as community center, CC, in New Friends Colony, which is located just adjacent to Batla House, Batla House is in Okhla, in South Delhi. So it's not backward. So her argument was that she mentioned that during monsoons, community center also gets flooded. The drains get clogged and litter is everywhere. And still, why is this area, Batla House, looked down upon as a backward area? So, starting with that, Lefebvre raised a very interesting point in critique of everyday life, that everyday life resembles theater, and that theater is able to resume, condense, and represent life for real spectators. So as a researcher or observer, this aspect forms an important practice to conduct oneself in the field so as to capture and represent life in its diverse, dynamic, and cruel forms. So as Vacant has vividly put it, I quote, ethnographic observation emerges as an indispensable tool, first to pierce the screen of discourses whirling around these territories of urban tradition, which lock inquiry within the biased parameter of the pre-constructed object, and secondly, to capture the vivid relations and meanings that are constitutive of the everyday reality of the marginal city dweller. So it's a process, it's a continuous process through which an observer, a researcher, can try to capture the different nuances of everyday reality, of the relations, meanings, and break them to constitute a critical hermeneutics of everyday life. So in this paper, I tried to draw by experiences, observations from the fieldwork, as well as the initial findings through the ethnographic inquiry that we did as of the housing rental market in Delhi as part of housing discrimination project, which is currently in its third phase, and we are in Mumbai now. So I'm particularly focused on my experiences in two sites in Delhi, Munirka and Jamia Nagar in Okhla. So it is an attempt to look at identity and space and identities and specialities through a study of housing market and my own field research experience. So as part of the project, understanding housing rental market in Delhi, talking to different actors involved, from a person looking to a house, broker, tenant, RWA, housing committee, and others, understanding the mechanisms and the ways it operates, one cannot reach to a conclusion to define housing rental market through a one possible definition. There cannot be a one possible way to define the rental market. A significant population of 27.5% of urban household lives in the rented apartments, according to 2011 census. So, though NSSO data says that 35% of urban households live in rental houses. So rental housing is as diverse as life in a metro city like Delhi can be. So according to the census report, 97% of urban rental relations are informal. They don't involve formal registered rental agreements. The way rental is performed in the housing varies in practice, legal, and formal to illegal and informal, and it's defined by the typologies of space of planned and authorized settlements and unplanned and unauthorized settlements. Moreover, rental in Delhi is also about an individual's access to social networks, the modes, the routes of access that are available, defined through one's identity and social location. All these play an important role in determining the choice of a tenant to pursue or look for a house in a particular area. So the production of rental spaces, in which places like Munirka become hub of rental activity, are also a response to people's migration to the city from the regions that are peripheries to the city, and the people within the city interchanging locations also. The coming of people in Munirka from northeastern regions is also a response to the market that has been created as a result of them coming to the city for education and jobs in particular. At the same time, the production of Muslim spaces such as Jamia Nagar is also a response to the city's one set of population that get clustered in a place associated to one identity based on their religious affiliation. But at the same time, the migrated population from Northeast and the marginal Muslim population in Jamia Nagar, in their everyday lives, lay a claim and ownership of the space they inhabit in a way to be identified not only as their space, but where they can perform their everyday activities in a homely manner. At the same time, it's also a story about how segregations not only operate at a spatial level, but is deeply imprinted to the physical bodies of the residents of this place simultaneously. The segregation thus operates as a spatial level intertwined with identities and is embodied in the bodies of the residents and becomes apparent and visible in the everyday interactions and in social relations. Thus, body and space gets conflated into each other, as described by Lafavre. Space, I quote, space as being neither a subject nor an object, but rather a set of social relations and forms. Here I look into a few instances and stories from the field of how discrimination operates, how residential segregation in Delhi, and what are the forms and mechanisms of discrimination in the rental market. A story that became a common trope during my fieldwork while talking to brokers in Munirka, who are mostly Jats, was about how Munirka is being overtaken by people from northeasterns, or as the brokers call them, Manipuris. Though there were significant population from from different northeastern states like Mizoram, Nagaland, and Manipur especially, but they used to call them as such Manipuris. So a common trait in this story was a street inside Munirka village, known by many names by the residents and the tenants. But the name airport was the most sensational one for brokers, and brokers, they were mostly Jats, who are residents of Munirka. Of all the names, the Jat brokers used to say that they meaning people from Northeast or Manipur, have named this choke as airport, putting an emphasis on the changing nature of the space. How they are overcrowding the place, occupying it with their presence, whole presence of them. It is living there in that space. The street starts from Anupam restaurant, located towards the Palam flyover side, and ends inside the Munirka village at Babulal Chowk, and has most of the shops and buildings by the people belonging to Northeast regions. The Jat brokers signified at the same time a loss of connection with the space, why people from Northeast have established themselves inside the village by claiming that you can't go to Babulal Chowk in the middle of the night, you will get beaten up. Imagine the residents of the space telling you that who own the buildings that you will get beaten up by the people who are the tenants there. So it's very ironic. So Munirka is an urban village, and it has a sprawling flow of tenants across the village from various regions of the country. On its one side, it's very close to Jawaharlal Nehru University, and on the other hand, it's easily connected to various parts of the city and Gurgaon also. And with metro extending through this area, dynamics would be changing more. The most interesting part of the story was when the brokers were asked why they in the sense that people from North Indians named it as airport. Most of them said we don't know, and they quote unquote Manipuris named it because they straight away came from Northeast and stay here with their relatives and friends. During the conversation with tenants who were from Northeast in the street spread from Anupam restaurant and Babulal Chowk, there were different narratives that one got to hear from them. One of the narratives was that in the initial years, when people from Northeast started living in Munirka, the Babulal Chowk during the monsoon season used to overflow with the sewage of the drains. There were human feces and sewage littered around the chowk. So they used to call it agpot, which in Kuki dialect means excreta. So as the Jat local community couldn't understand this word, they misunderstood it as airport, not airport. So other narrative was that when a person from Northeast, or say from any state of the Northeast, Manipur, Mizoram, or Nagaland, arrives in Delhi, so they are asked to drop at Anupam restaurant, which is situated towards the Palam flyover road. From there, they are told to walk straight to the street till Babulal Chowk. The street till Babulal Chowk is very narrow, and it suddenly opens up when you enter the Babulal Chowk, making the space seem to be more open and spacious and airy. Then from here, they are picked or lifted up by the friends and relatives and taken to their respective rooms. So this place then signified as airport for both the brokers and the tenants from the Northeast. But at the same time, the different narratives tell us how a street becomes a contested space as the population migrates. As a population who is not part of the city migrates into a city, how a name in itself brings with itself different narratives of imagining a space with the narrative of belongingness with the city and a sense of loss with their region. At the same time, it becomes a story for the Jat community losing of their culture, control, and assertion of the space, even though they are the owners of this space, they own it, they are the landlords. In, in this story lies the history of the migration, conflict, violence, and differences which at the same time emerge as they associate themselves with the city by creating a space of their own, which the people from Northeastern call as home. The narratives in itself brings in different dynamics of housing and living in a city for those who have migrated from other regions, especially from Northeast and are settling in Delhi. The Jats being major community who owns buildings in Munirka village, this area, and they were also residents, and so they were in a sense very entrenched in the area. So many brokers had open prejudices against the Northeast tenants, and a lot of them denied houses in the area. In certain locations in Munirka, like Budhvihar, owners don't prefer to give houses to tenants from Northeast region, or there is an unnotified ban. Some even mention that they are engaged in activities like drugs and prostitution. Some even call them animal eaters. So these prejudices were mostly prevalent among Jat brokers and brokers there. So at the same time, due to the large clientele of the people from the Northeast region, it also became a space where they can't reject them because their economy is dependent on them. In 2014, for example, there was a major talk among the Jat residents in Munirka that they wanted to ban Northeastern tenants coming into Munirka. But so a significant population of Jats said, we won't give houses, we won't rent, and we won't allow them to enter into the houses. But again, there were other Jats who said, listen, you rent out a dependency in a Muslim concentrated has been called a Muslim ghetto, or in itself is spatially very distinct and includes many Muslims, and Atla House and Abul Fazal are two of the areas within Jamia Nagar where I conducted my.
I think that, just to connect out with Rajarshee's paper, I think one of the things that if we were pushing on this side to think about the distinction between disciplinary and caring state, resistance versus production, here I'm actually quite struck about how one begins to separate coexistence from segregation. Right? So if you think a little bit about, so it's interesting you both invoke Lefebvre. Right? So Lefebvre is a Marxist anthropologist. So when he writes about the cultural life of the everyday, violence is part of that narrative. It is an everyday shaped by structures of power. It is not everyday as in the quotidian. It is structured by class. The difference between the Manipuris and the Jats, the category, you give up certain choices, or an everyday life that is more violent, but you insist on making the choices you have a right to make, claims that you want to make. How do we deal with this disjunction? But thank you very much for your provocations. Please join me before questions to thank all three of our panelists for a set of very, very interesting provocations. The floor is open. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. Before that, I'm going to just remind us of 2 words that everyone understands until an academic conference begins. The first is the word question. A word question is asked in order to solicit something from another person as opposed to offer them your argument. Second is comment, which is very welcome, does not have to be a question, but must be distinguished from the idea of treatise or declaration. That said, please be brief. Okay, I'll take 1 here, I'll take 2, and I'll take 3, and I'll take 4, and then we'll do 1 round. Folks, take notes. We'll do them in bunches, okay?
Yeah, this is just following from a lot of what the man on your right has already said. And I think as urban scholars and people interested in all kinds of urban futures, to take a political position of this neat, demarcated tension between the margins and the state, as a political position is a fine thing and we need to take that, but and this is a comment, but as a conceptual category we really need to push the messiness of the everyday, because what then it lends to is the further silencing of the voice and agency of the margins. So yeah, I could go on, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, hi. My name is Deepak, and I just wanted to understand from Asaf that while you were, talking about Jamia Nagar, very well articulated and very well said, like it is a ghettoization of Muslim. But while I was studying in Jamia, what my professor used to say is that it is a ghettoization of Muslim, but at the same time of a different class, because you see there are, high class Muslims stay there, but it is not that way. So what is your understanding on that, if you can little bit brief on? And one more thing which I wanted to understand from you is that while you are exploring these rental things, can you give us little bit of gender perspective where things are missing, because there are rape and other cases coming up, and for that, like, mostly people from northeast per se is targeted. So I want to understand. Thank you.
Hi, this is for Rajarshee. In your research work, would you be also exploring the role of judiciary for the taking for pushing state to take care of its inhabitants, or for that matter, taking cues from to taking cues from the judiciary to disciplinary those living on the margins?
Hi, I'm Swastik. First is to Rajarshee, which is that I think a couple of points already Gautam raised about what is a counter-urban culture and so on and so forth. I think there's a constancy to that and so on and so forth, which you have to be cognizant of. And the other thing I'd like to also underline is this idea of the state, and in fact, many of the categories that you're using, such as state or private capital or community or things like that, basically are not so monolithic. So it's important that you get, and you did with your little anecdote at the end, you broke that and got into that one particular person who represents, in a sense, the state, but came up with a very rich kind of argument. And at least as a starting point, at least as far as the state is concerned, there is a political state and then there is an administrative state, and they really have their own countercultures inside them, basically. So that's just one point for you. Asaf, I think some excellent stories. Thank you very much. I just have a suggestion. I mean, you should really think about specializing some of these stories, having some sense of, because the airport is like, but it's a spatial construct, and it would be really enriching to your study if you are able to demonstrate what the spatiality of this setup or this whole sort of social relation is. A general comment to all three researchers, which is that what I felt a little missing was a bit of a meta narrative. We are talking about identity and culture, but I didn't see or hear too much about yourself as the observer and the researcher in your researches.
Hello. Yeah. So coming to the first question which you had raised on the elite versus the non-elite conundrum, and Ananya Roy's concept of whirling, etc. You see, when I had spoken about the methodology, I had mentioned that I had included two menu charts of Pice hotels. Now, Pice hotels, I'm trying to reroute the answer of elite, not versus the non-elite, but the Pice hotels are basically commercially cheap restaurants in Kolkata, which have existed from colonial times, where meals are, it derives from the word paisa actually. And here, whole meals are served. Each meal is priced individually, but the most important part of price hotels is that the menu chart and the menu actually changes every day. So you have this board where you write these menus, and it's basically depends on the availability of raw food ingredients. Now, when I asked my respondents when I asked them to code all the menu cards and menu charts, so what they said that these were actually for Pati people. Pati is a Bengali word, which means the uncouth. Okay, so it's for the uncouth precisely because why? Because it's actually because these are cheap items, which can be readily bought. So the compromised social and economic standing of people who actually make these purchases in pice hotels, seamlessly kind of meshes with their coarse tastes. Now, when I went to the proprietor of one of the stores, Bhojahori Manna, a capital market analyst who owns the store, Siddhartha Chatterjee, he told me that, I want to go back to this old world charm of pice hotels, and I want to recreate the charm of pice hotels, in my restaurant menu cards, because, I'll buy these stuff readily from the market and serve these fresh food for people in my restaurants. So what is important here, I mean, why I'm speaking about pice hotels and about things like that, is that, the larger question, I mean, to put it in a larger question, the point that I'm trying to make is that there is a division that is emerging between the old Bengali middle class and the new Bengali middle class. The way in which the new Bengali middle class, so, the new Bengali middle class, the Bong, he will not find pice hotels really a place to belong to. But he's also, again, not adverse to the ideology of pice hotels once he comes to Bhojahori Manna and says that, yes, this is the way in which we will appropriate the culture. So, appropriation of one's own ethnic culture has to be steeped in a manner which has to suit to global tastes, So that is the point. And also the other point that I would like to mention is that the concept of elite as far as the Bengali population is concerned is also very problematic. I use two words. One is aristocrat, that one is dhoni, which means moneyed, and the other is obhijatu, which is aristocrat. Now these two are again not the same, because the aristocrat, if we go back to Bengali middle class imagination of aristocrat, then it's linked to education, the privileging of education over wealth. Okay, and if we go to the dhoni, these are people, the new moneyed middle class, who again really do not only want to be exhibitionists, but they want their tastes, their cultivated tastes, they want to have choices which would reflect their cultivated taste. So, it's not a flat narrative. There are many layers to it. And I think that these need to be investigated more. But I do believe that there is a shift in the concept of Bengaliness, the way in which we understand Bengaliness. Okay. The other question is about caste in food. Yes, of course, there is a lot of literature. Henrique Donner, who has actually worked on vegetarianism in urban Bengal and has published a lot. There are other works also, but as far as what I have studied, the population, the affluent urban middle class population, I'll make a claim here. Bengalis, educated Bengalis, as far as it is concerned, they are all Derosians. Here, I would like to make a distinction between the public and the private spaces. Public and private. In the public space, of course, Mahashweta, I had quoted Mahashweta. Mahashweta says that one of the best, when I probed her, that you want all these dishes. No, the dish I liked most was my thak pishima. My grandma aunt had magic in her hands. She cooked the best recipes. But in the public domain, Bengali food is found tempting only when it is catapulted to the realm of this exotic province of taste. That is the kind of argument. And the question of how to engage with, I'll end with an anecdote. My cousin brother lives in Bangalore for the last 13 years. My nephew is 5-year-old. He comes to Kolkata. And one day, I don't know, he just starts mixing glasses, pours glasses, drinks. So I could make out that he has seen a bartender and he's imitating that. The next day, my sister-in-law comes in and tells me that we don't drink. I don't know why she was explaining her case to me because I had not raised the question. She simply blurted it out, out of context. So in the private domain, I mean, I'd like to push this argument. I think M.N. Srinivas was so brilliant when he says that, we all subscribe to a kind of dual culture. In the private realm, of course, you have you cultivate certain kinds of idioms of food. In the public realm, on the other hand, you can pose to be a DeRozan, even if you're not. So, thank you, if it answers.
Thank you so much for those questions. I'll take them in order. So the first, I think, observation was what kind of politics that sort of emerge out of fear. Did I get you right on that? Yeah. So the existing literature, to cut a long story short, we probably say politics of exclusion. Throughout the 80s and 90s, we have a literature on urban fear, which, as I emphasize once again, has to do with security, has to do with gentrification, has to do with gated communities, has to do with policing and surveilling spaces. So at one level, so when I surveyed the literature present, I found out that the dominant narrative was how do we secure spaces. So the entire idea of securing spaces is exclusionary to its very core. What I believe, while I'm investigating fear from the margins, what I'm trying to do is I am showing that fear need not necessarily be about exclusion. While it is the dominant thing, will still remain exclusion, but here the connotation would be different in the sense that fear would not push you inwards, but rather outwards, in the sense that you are forced to communicate. You're scared, you're communicating, be it the state, be it the non-state actors, you are making a case for yourself. So at this point, I'd probably stop for the sake of brevity. Okay. Second one, possibility to differentiate between the caring and the disciplining state. I think we need to keep this in mind because, again, for the margins, and I think we've also had presentations which have said that there are no amenities that are available or are extended to the population living in informal colonies. But for them, the state is absent there in that case. But if we were to, but then when it comes to evictions or demolitions, the police, the state, the courts, they're all present. They don't just come up out of nowhere. So I think that distinction I'm sort of trying to. The third point which you said had to do with moment. Could you repeat that? Okay, so I think if I got you right, it's sort of where does the counter-urban consciousness lie? Why specifically locate it at the point of violence? Because prior to the evictions or the violence or the treatment that the police or the state, again, that they're meted out to, they are disparate, discrete blocks. So you might be a bhatt from the Rajasthani community, a musician from Andhra Pradesh, or a puppeteer from somewhere else. But it is the moment when they feel the presence of the state in its disciplinary avatar that they feel that there is more to their identity than these localized versions. Instead, they sort of wish to make their presence felt as equal parts of the city as any other. Just another one. Someone asked a question about judiciary.
Do you want to study the judiciary?
Yeah, that comes in later, but only when I have sufficiently interacted with the people on ground.
You,
So, how to your question, I don't look at a city as coexistence and segregation, but I look at as existence and coexistence, where segregation exists parallel to both of these. So yeah, because when you see each other as alien, there is no assimilation, but there is accommodation, and accommodation happens on my terms and conditions. And it's like you play with them or just get out. And these terms and conditions are not set by a marginal resident of a city, but those who are dominant. So here comes the question of agency. So yes, I have agency, but this agency is relational to a lot of factors. But how I express my agency is also to do with the choices, which are predetermined and not only predetermined, but